Hello. One central question for this course is, how did the food industry change over the course of the 20th century? Well, in order to look at change, you have to look at the before and after. So with this in mind, let's take a close look at 7 characteristics of American society at the beginning of the 20th century, 1900. First, let's take a look at the increase in industrialism at the beginning of the 20th century. Here, we had a rise in centers of industry, mostly in the East Coast, but major cities in the United States where machines, electricity, factories, efficiency, people working to process and package and create new products grew rapidly. So how did this affect the food industry? Well, we can look at this in a couple of ways. One is that it increased the amount of time that our food passed between the farm and the fork. It also, in doing so, increased the amount of steps along the way from the farm to the fork. And finally, in increasing the time and the amount of steps in between, we have an increased amount of opportunity for things to go wrong. Cross-contamination, foodborne bacteria, etc. The second factor we want to take a look at is the rise in population. During this time, the first decade of the 1900s, great numbers of people were immigrating to the United States from European nations and from Asia. How big was this? Well, to put it in perspective, in the several decades leading up to the year 1900, the most amount of people that immigrated to the United States each decade was about 3 million people. Between 1900 and 1910, however, it almost tripled. So one might ask, how did this increase in population from immigration affect the American food industry? Well, there's a number of ways. One is that we literally had more mouths to feed. The demand, the market increased. Another way to look at it is that with more people, you now have more opportunities for stress on our health infrastructure, the water, the food system, more opportunities for contamination and for foodborne outbreaks. The third factor we want to take a look at is significant urbanization. Taken on its own, all this industrialization obviously would lead to urbanization, the growth of cities around these places, these centers of industry. Throw in the increase in population, all these people had to have places to live. They mostly would live where the jobs would be. Therefore, we had, again, a reason for this growth in urbanization. As one might obviously ask, how did this significant urbanization affect the food industry? Well, again, we have a number of ways, both in terms of geography and in terms of the people. In terms of the geography, with the growth of urban areas, you have the displacement or the shrinking of rural areas. You have less and less place for agriculture and less land for cattle and other livestock. In terms of people, you now have a greater concentration or density of people in these urban areas who can become sick from foodborne pathogen outbreaks. Consequently, with all this greater density of people, there's more opportunity for illness to pass from person to person. The fourth factor we want to look at is the increase in affluence. We're not just talking about Carnegie and Rockefeller, but the average person here. Prior to this period of time, most people lived and worked in their farms and in their communities. There wasn't a lot in terms of income. Now, with this rise in industry and urbanized areas, you had people with incomes. At the same time, with the immigration and the increase in population, these immigrants might be looked at as people who didn't have the same income as before. Now they have income. To answer that question of how does an increase in affluence affect the food industry, well, now there was an increasing demand for food of animal origin, meat, milk, eggs, etc. This kind of food not only is a common vehicle for foodborne disease, but it's also a food source that requires more and more processing steps in order to meet the demands of that market. Similar to our previous factor of affluence, changing lifestyles was a factor in which we saw a significant change in the nature of the consumer. At this point in time, with the industrialization that we previously talked about, women and children were increasingly leaving the house to go to work. As they were leaving the house and spending more time out of the house, we have an increase in the amount of population that was eating outside of the house. They were eating prepackaged foods, they were eating foods from catering establishments, and they were also eating foods from street vendors. Our sixth factor is a greater amount of international movement of food and people. During this decade, we had greater number of outbreaks of disease related to imported foods. Additionally, immigration aside, we had an increase in the number of people who were traveling abroad, thus increasing their opportunity for contracting some kind of foodborne illness. Our seventh and final factor is that there was a greater proportion of the population that was more susceptible to foodborne illness. With all this immigration, we welcomed the elderly, the malnourished, and those with pre-existing conditions or who had an immune system that had already been compromised due to disease from their home country. These groups of people were much more susceptible to diseases and illnesses in the New World that they had never been exposed to before. So why are these factors so important, and what does this all mean? Well, industrialization changed the nature of that span between the farm and the fork. The population increase was a rising tide for the demand of all foods. Urbanization impacted the size and location of all food sources. Both affluence and the changing lifestyles changed the very nature of the consumer. And the international movement of food and people, as well as the fact that the population was more susceptible to foodborne illness, only impacted the size and severity of foodborne illnesses. The significance of all this is that the 20th century was one of great change, both positive and negative, in terms of the economic and social aspects of food.